I'll be reading Genesis 22, verses 1 through 14. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he answered. "Take your son," he said, "your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about." So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand, he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." Then the 2 of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." He replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." So today it is said, "It will be provided on the Lord's mountain."
Good morning to you all. My name's Kevin Perry, for those of you that don't know me, and I am not normally the fella up here speaking. That would be Joel, but he's out of town, and so I get the pleasure of stepping in. You know, some folks really have a hard time when their kids go off to school, get, a little weepy, that sort of thing. That's not my wife. I was traveling a lot, and she was at home with 2 little boys who were very energetic. And so by the time the school system decided that they would help her, she was ready for a celebration. This was not a time for crying. This was a time for, clapping and turning back flips. And it was a little different, though, when my eldest son went off to college. Whole different story. My youngest son, Zachary, still remembers I was out of town. I was actually in Kenya, and Zachary remembers standing there in the driveway holding his mom as she bawled her eyes out, that her son was gone. And she wasn't crying out of worry. She was crying just because she knew that the relationship was changing forever and that she was going to miss his presence in the home. So sometime early in his freshman year of college, Chris comes to me and she says that she really feels like God is communicating to her that she should put Seth on the altar. Now, we don't have any idea what this means, That was the first question out of my mouth is, well, goodness, what does that mean? And she said, "I'm really not sure yet. That's the recurring message that keeps coming." And so I had, like I said, been to Kenya, and I had visited an orphanage, and so then got to telling him about it. He got to talking with the folks that supported the orphanage and decided that, hey, that's how I'd like to spend my freshman summer. I want to go to Kenya, work as an intern at the orphanage. Well, I had already been there. I was quite familiar with the place and with the people that ran it, and so we were both very much at ease about him going. And if you had known Seth at the time, it would have been impossible to be around him for very long without hearing about this trip he was getting ready to make. I mean, the kid was bouncing off the walls, excited about it. And Seth's always been a bit of a child whisperer, so it just seemed like it was going to fit in perfectly. And so he hurried back from Auburn when his second semester was over and packed up and headed off to Africa. Well, he went with a friend of Chris's, a friend of ours, an adult. I mean, of course, he's 19 at the time, so he's an adult himself. But she was going to escort him over there and stay for about 10 days and then return. Seth was going to stay there until August. And so about a week into the trip, Chris gets this call from Seth. And the anxiety is loud and clear. He is absolutely convinced he has made the wrong decision. And he needs to come home. He needs to come home with the escort, so in just a few days, he wants to get on a plane and leave. And so now here's my wife, faced with this situation where she's got her child halfway around the world, basically begging to come home and wanting his mama to help him come home. And it crystallized what God had been talking about when he said, put Seth on the altar. What was she to do? Leave Seth on the altar in God's hands, or do what her son wanted? I think these situations and our choices in them are going to be made on what our heart believes. We're going to struggle. We're going to try to tell ourselves what our head knows. But we're going to find that in these really tough situations, our heart wins out. And so I believe that most of my life, I was reared understanding that this particular chapter in the Scripture, Abraham's the protagonist. That's what the chapter's about. It's all about Abraham. I mean, when I was growing up in Sunday school and listening in church, that was the message I was getting, was need to be like Abraham. Well, everything came down to something else, and I want us to listen to our text this morning and see if we can spot it. Listen to the first part of verse 1 again. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. The text leaves no doubt as to who determined that this test was going to happen. God initiated the testing. And this is really not uncommon. It's very intentional that he is doing it, and it's going to be an incredibly difficult journey for Abraham. But this is not out of step with what we see in other areas in the Bible when it comes to testing. God was the one that essentially provoked the devil in regards to Job and all the testing that occurred with him. And then when we read Matthew's gospel, it's very clear that the Spirit was the one that led Jesus into the desert to be tempted by the devil. But we can take heart that God knows the purpose, the extent, the outcome, and the ongoing impact of every test. Testing and temptation are often two sides of the same coin. God's purpose includes our growth in his glory. Satan's intent is to deceive us into failing the test. And in his mind, he thinks he's hindering God's purposes. Well, whenever there's a test, there's also a temptation to disobedience, which is in effect failing the test. So whether we describe what's going on in our lives as temptation by the adversary or testing by God, we know what God has promised. Listen to the words of James. Consider it a great joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you experience various trials, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance. And let endurance have its full effect so that you may be mature and complete, lacking nothing. The value of the test, the trial, or the temptation comes from what we learn. The joy is in the expectation that on the other side there is maturity and completeness in having all that God wants for us. Abraham is being tested by God, but it's not at all hard to imagine what the voice of Satan is saying in his mind. What we do is going to depend on what we believe. So let's take a look as we go through this, see if we can see what Abraham's actions reveal about what Abraham believes. Does he testify by his actions that he believes the words of James that haven't even been written yet? Let's see if there's any indication that he's spending any time listening to what Satan has to say. So let's note his response and his response times. They're immediate, right from the start. Let's finish verse 1. Here I am, he answered. Abraham doesn't hesitate. We as parents know the difference between hesitation and not, okay? When I call the name of my child, if my child immediately answers, I know that they hear my voice and they're ready to hear what I have to say. And if I call my child and they don't, then that sends an all different message, okay? Not nearly as healthy. So God doesn't mince words in his instructions in verse 2. Take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. I don't want us to rush through this command. We have all heard this story over and over and over. And if we're not careful, we get kind of lulled into a place where we really don't hear the details. We don't take it in context. We don't put ourselves in the situation to try to understand what's happening. I don't know how many times I have heard this story. And I know I've gotten it down what the immediate, the intermediate, and the eternal outcomes are. But Abraham doesn't know right now how this is going to work out. He knows God's going to keep his promises, but he doesn't know how he's going to keep his promises. He doesn't know the entire story is a foreshadowing of Jesus coming on the cross. He has no idea that there's going to come a day when God follows through with this unimaginable request, not in Abraham's interest, but in his. It's going to be his son. Don't miss the magnitude of what God is commanding and how ignorant Abraham is at the time. Sit and absorb just how horrifying this verse is and what it would mean about God if it ends without the grace and mercy that we all know is coming. The command is alarming. See, we know that God hates human sacrifice. He makes that clear in the future through his word in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Kings, Chronicles, Psalms, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel all reveal the same thing. God detests human sacrifice. But remember, this is occurring hundreds of years before that law is going to be given. Leviticus 18, which doesn't come until after the Egyptian slavery, forbids many practices that previously had not been directly prohibited by God. And from our context, we look back on it and we say, well, you just should know those things are wrong. But we do have to remember it had not been declared yet. I mean, incest, adultery, taking sister wives, sacrificing children in the fire to Molech, homosexuality, bestiality. Seeing this command from God the way Abraham saw it, without the knowledge of the law and without the coming of the Messiah, is practically impossible for us. We're being asked to imagine a scenario where we didn't know a whole lot of what we know. We know how God views human sacrifice, even just through one example in Jeremiah. They have built the high places of Topeth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. It's just that Abraham doesn't know all this. Let's just stop and acknowledge that this command is incomprehensible and what a monster it is to ask. Isaac is the child of promise, the one through whom the innumerable lineage is going to come, the one who displaced the son of the slave, the one seen as Abraham's only son, and the one that he loved. It is impossible to miss the foreshadowing. Isaac is referred to as Abraham's only son. Jesus is God's only son. At Jesus' baptism, Matthew records God's view of Jesus. And a voice from heaven said, "This is my beloved son with whom I am well pleased." John's testimony regarding Jesus' relation to God is clear. He gave his one and only son. Abraham isn't aware of just how much he and God have in common at the moment. So what does Abraham know? Well, he's heard that burnt offering is common in the religions he's surrounded by. And since he's still learning who God is, it may not have seemed so out of place that God would ask this of him, because that's what the other deities were asking of the people that followed them. But here's what Abraham does know. He's in a relationship with someone who has never been wrong about what he proclaimed. Everything he's told Abraham was going to happen has come to pass. Even some crazy miraculous things like a child coming from his 90-year-old wife. He's come through a lengthy series of tests, and some of these he's failed, and some of these he's passed. But through every one of them, he has learned more and more about God. He has learned that through it all, God can be trusted. Abraham's next actions are in keeping with the belief that would cause unwavering faith. Look at how urgently he behaves in verse 3. So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. Urgency, intentionality, and the performance of tasks that normally would have been left to slaves. This is a man on a mission. He got up early. He saddled his own donkey. He split his own wood. And then he set out. And just as a sidebar, I don't know what it is about donkeys, but I think God likes them because they show up in some of the coolest stories. The length of the journey in verse 4 is another foreshadowing. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." Just as Jesus walked alone with his father after his arrest, Isaac does the same. Now, some scholars think Abraham's telling the young men and Isaac a little white lie when he says, "We'll come back," as in he and Isaac together will come back. I believe that it's more proof that he didn't know exactly how God was going to work, but he believed God was going to bring about what he promised. And the writer of Hebrews agrees. Hebrews 11:17 through 19. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, and yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, "Your offspring will be traced through Isaac." He considered God to be able even to raise someone from the dead. Therefore, he received him back, figuratively speaking. I can't help but think of the words of the boys at the furnace. We know what God can do. We know what God may do. But even if he doesn't, we are still going to obey him. Abraham is operating on past interactions with God and the promises he has already seen fulfilled, not the immediate future, which is where our focus so often gets riveted. Verse 6 continues the foreshadowing. Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. The wood was laid on Isaac. The cross was laid on Jesus. After his arrest, all Jesus' followers either scattered or were kept at a distance as Jesus walked on in obedience to his Father. Verse 7 reveals what's going on in Isaac's mind. Then Isaac spoke to his father Abraham and said, "My father." And he replied, "Here I am, my son." Isaac said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" This is like a fair question coming from a young man. I mean, he's old enough to carry the wood, And he's old enough to see what information he's lacking, and he's still young enough to ask the question. This narrative really contains, the whole thing contains no evidence about what Abraham and Isaac feel. We just keep seeing what they do. We got to be careful if we stand in this spot in time, knowing all that we know, and conjecture about what was going on in the mind and the hearts of these two men. We should take pause before we start talking too firmly about anything they were thinking. Abraham's answer does give further evidence of what he believes. Abraham answered, verse 8, God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. Then the two of them walked on together. Now, is Abraham telling a white lie, or is this what he believes? I think Abraham's actions and his verbal communication continue to support each other. He doesn't know how all this is going down, but he is done coming up with his own solutions to hard problems. His entire plan seems to be trust God. Verse 9 begins a slowing of the pace of the story. When they arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. He bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham built the altar just like he had done 3 times before. The time lapse of the story is slowing and the tension is rising, even as we get the details of what Abraham is doing. There's no evidence that Abraham was dragging his feet, trying to take more time, or that he was trying to hold off where this was headed. But the moment of truth is on him. You remember Seth over in Africa? On the phone, very upset, talking to his mother. Chris had a choice, and she set her sight. She set her sight on God. She listened to what her son had to say, and then she calmly said, Seth, what's the departure date on your plane ticket? He begrudgingly gave it. And that's when she said, well, then that's when you're coming home. So he hung up, ghosted us for 2 weeks. During that time, Chris was struggling with some fear. She told God about it. Lord, what happens if my son dies in Africa due to my obedience? And here's what she felt like she heard him say. If your son dies, I will be with you. You'll buy a ticket, go to Kenya, and retrieve his body. And I will supply you all you need to persevere. It may not have been what she wanted to hear, but it definitely caused her to believe she was not alone in the journey. Now, Seth tried 2 more times that summer. The same thing. One of them was 2 weeks before he came back. Each time, Chris gave him the same answer. In fact, all she had to do was just say, do you have your plane ticket? Mom. Oh my goodness. I was so proud of my wife. And so thankful to God that he prepared her in advance for the test that was coming. Her belief and resulting resolve to obey God was a powerful testimony to both me and my boys. Today, Seth will tell you that his mother was right. And Chris will tell you that she can take no credit. God orchestrated that whole story and supplied her every need to walk in obedience. Unlike Seth, There's no record of Isaac resisting Abraham. He's strong enough to carry wood, and many scholars place him in his teenage years. Some think he could have been closer to the age of Jesus when he died. Either way, it seems that he could have resisted his 100-plus-year-old father if he'd had any intent to. The similarities to Jesus are impossible to miss. Isaac is placed on the wood as Jesus was placed on the cross. Isaac was bound by ropes as Jesus was bound by nails. Neither son resisting what was being done to them. Abraham's belief and resulting resolve is also a powerful testimony. Verse 10 leaves no room for doubt. Then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. He is going to kill his son in obedience to God. We have no indication that he was expecting a last-minute reprieve. And so verse 11 is where the story of Abraham and Isaac sharply diverge from the story of God and Jesus. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he replied, "Here I am." The last-minute call is an urgent stop of action. And this is a pattern. Moses, don't profane sacred ground. Samuel, stop answering to Eli. And Saul, stop persecuting me and mine. Many scholars believe the places in Scripture where it says the angel of the Lord, that's used as opposed to an angel of the Lord. It's referring to the pre-incarnate Christ. And if that's true, and I believe it is, Jesus Christ, the one who at Calvary did not get the last-minute reprieve, now commands Abraham to stop and give him his attention. Look at verse 12. Then he said, "Do not lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me." In the perfect timing of God's mercy and grace, Abraham and Isaac are both saved. Isaac from death, and Abraham from the most emotionally painful thing he would have ever had to face. Some commentators have spent a lot of time trying to reconcile the idea that God now knows something that he didn't know before. I lean in the direction that God is speaking in ways that we can understand. But he's not really worried about the fact that we don't have a clue what his now looks like. It's all a big now to God. He's omniscient. And no commentator, scholar, or human other than Jesus has any idea what it's like to be omniscient. Verse 13 records God's revelation to Abraham. Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its thorns. Therese, you did that to me. Horns. So Abraham went and took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Looking up has so many different connotations, from a simple physical act all the way to supernatural sight. I think that we've got to include coming to the realization of in the list. Just like Jesus on the walk to Emmaus was there the whole time, but they didn't see him till he said so. The sacrificial animal for the sins of people will be threaded all through the story of God's people until Jesus became the final sacrifice. There is so much I could get wrong in this presentation of this text. But one thing I know, God hits a home run every time this story is told. Because we are face to face with the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. That's the message of this story. by Abraham's own testimony. It's not mainly about him or Isaac. Look at verse 14. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it is said, it will be provided on the Lord's mountain. God provided everything. Just to name a few, God provided Abraham a relationship that included a series of tests to lead him into an understanding of himself. God provided a fertile womb and a 90-year-old Sarah. God provided the child of his promise, Isaac. God provided the relationship between Abraham and Isaac that assured Isaac's willing obedience. God provided the perfectly timed call to Abraham. God provided the ram. And through it all, God is providing a clear foreshadowing for us, pointing to the provision of his beloved only Son as the final sacrifice. The gospel's not just about Jesus dying for our sin. It's his resurrection, his sending of the Spirit, his return, and life eternal with the Father, Jesus, the Spirit, and all the saints. The death of Jesus in our place is the mercy of the gospel. His resurrection is the amazing grace of the gospel. His sending the Spirit is the power of the gospel. Life eternal is the guaranteed hope of the gospel. Following Jesus is just the beginning. And regardless of your immediate circumstances, the story is not yet finished. God provides in the past, in the present, and in the future. None of us can claim to know the details of how our story ends. And I think that's what verses 15 through 18 are trying to remind us. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I have sworn, this is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring because you have obeyed my command. Now that's the big picture. God swore by himself. He made himself the guarantee of the blessings, the guarantee of the multiplication of his people and of victory over the enemy, and the blessings that he will pour out through Jesus to all the nations of the earth. This story is not about us trying to be like Abraham. It can't primarily be about Isaac. He's not even mentioned after they put him on the altar. This story is about our God who sees and provides. He has provided, he is providing, and he will provide all that he promised. That's really good news. But I want to give you one word of caution. Be careful about what you come to think God has promised. We may skip to our preconceived expectations if we do not know what Scripture says. The answer to Chris's question about Seth was not answered with, it's going to be okay, he won't die. There are many things that we are not promised that we really wish we were. And there are many things that Jesus has assured us of that we really wish he hadn't. But here's what I know we're promised by God, who has proven himself trustworthy. Those who believe will trust on his Son. He will never leave or forsake us. He will provide what we need to walk in obedience to him. He will cause us to persevere to the end. And he will work all things for the good of those who love him and are called to his purpose. and he will take us to himself for eternity. You can take that one to the bank.